All right, let's go ahead and get started on a lecture here, a bit more business oriented, but we're going to start talking about consumers and producers surplus. You'll notice here that these are plural, these apostrophes, and we'll make the distinction there between the singular and plural versions of these. Let's go ahead and just get started right in here. So these definitions that we're going to see right off the bat are informal. We're going to just talk about consumer surplus right in the beginning for the first half, and then we'll talk about producer surplus for the second half, and then we'll tack on a little example just to do really quickly. So let's say, and I know there's a lot on this slide. Just let's look at this right here, right in the top here, just this big box, if you will. So an informal definition. Let's say that you plan to spend $100 on a pair of shoes. So you walk into the mall, you go into a store, and you say, "All right, I've got $100. I'm going to buy a pair of shoes." And then when you walk into the store, you've got these shoes set on your mind. You say, "I'm going to pay $100 for them." But let's say they only cost 60. You're happy. You're ecstatic. You're saying, "Great. I was planning on spending $100. I was okay with spending $100. I would have handed them $100 gladly if that's what the price tag was. But it only cost 60." So what we would say is that for you specifically, just for you as an individual, your individual consumer surplus, notice individual, singular, your individual consumer surplus is that extra $40 that you quote unquote saved. You didn't actually save it, you still spent $60. But in your mind, you were planning on spending $100 and then you ended up only having to spend 60. So in your mind, it seemed like you saved $40 off what you were planning on spending. That's your individual consumer surplus. Now, presumably there's other people that want to go buy these shoes, and there's other people that do go in and they buy these shoes after you buy them. And maybe for those other people, maybe they didn't want to spend $100. Maybe they wanted to just spend 80. Maybe they wanted to spend 120. And so their individual consumer surplus is quite different from yours. Well, if we take everybody's individual consumer surplus and we add them all up, that is known as the consumer's surplus. You'll notice the plural here. So consumer's surplus is adding up every buyer's individual consumer surplus. So obviously, if you put yourself in the shoes of the company, the person selling the shoes, the owner of the store, you don't want consumer surplus. That's not a good thing, because if your customers are willing to spend 100 or 120 or $80, if they're willing to spend more than your cost, well, you could just increase your cost and they'd still be willing to buy. And so you could make more money off of that. So consumer surplus is not a good thing for the seller, but it is a good thing for the consumer. And we've got this plural versus the singular distinction. And as we've kind of explained in this idea, everybody has a different individual consumer surplus, because while you might be willing to spend $100 for that pair of shoes, maybe I'm only willing to spend 80, or heck, maybe I'm willing only to spend 50. And even then, I'm only willing to spend 50, but they cost 60. So maybe I don't even buy them. So everybody has a different individual consumer surplus. But if we add them all up, we get the consumer's surplus. So this is an informal definition. Obviously, we're just talking about the specific scenario. We're talking about a pair of shoes. We're just kind of vaguely defining this consumer surplus. So let's go ahead and look at this in a more mathematical standpoint. So we're going to start off here. Let's say that we've got axes here, price and quantity. We've seen these before. So we're going to talk about supply and demand of, let's say, the shoes that we're buying, these $60 pair of shoes. So we start off with price and quantity for our axes. The next thing that we want to consider is, let's say we have a demand curve. And we've seen these demand curves before. At a very high price in this range up here, we've got high price points. And that means that the quantity is fairly low. It's fairly small for a quantity, because if the price of this item is really high, people aren't going to want to buy it. So the quantity that are actually demanded is really small. But now, if my price is really small here, And so this is my price point right there. My quantity that's demanded is really large because if something's really cheap, then more people are going to want to demand it. They're going to want to buy it. And so we've got this negative sloping graph here indicating our demand curve. Well, continuing on, in some sense of this, we will have a supply curve that has a positive slope here, and we've seen that. And that intersection right there is going to indicate an equilibrium point. And so I'll go ahead and label that here. This equilibrium point is just exactly where the demand meets the supply. So where the price and the quantity sort of perfectly balance out so that the amount that's demanded and the amount that's supplied, they just balance out in a really nice way. So what we've got here with these equilibrium points is we've got a difference for some of these people. We have at certain price points, we have quantities that are smaller than the quantity that should be produced. And when I say should be, I mean this equilibrium point. And even another way you could think about this is if our quantities are smaller, we have price points that are higher than the price point that should be set at. And so we've got this equilibrium point, and really I want to focus on this area up here. I want to focus on this difference between the equilibrium price and the price that might be set here. Well, if we go ahead and we look at this area here, this is in fact the definition of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus, as we've seen on an individual standpoint, it talks about the difference between the price that you are willing to pay and the price that is set. So if we make an assumption, which is a fairly good assumption to make, it's a fairly assumable assumption. If we make the assumption that stores are going to set the pair of shoes at this equilibrium price, P naught, there are some people that will be in this range of prices. They will gladly spend these higher prices, but because that's only priced at P naught, there is a difference right here given by this area. And so that difference in what they're willing to pay versus what they have to pay, that's the definition of consumer surplus. So we're looking at this area here as the definition of consumer surplus. And to come up with a much more formal definition of this, we can actually lead ourselves into the thought of integrals. Because as we've seen, when we talk about an area, we relate that in a calculus sense to integrals. So we've talked about as well area between curves. And what I notice is I've got a function here, this line, this linear function, and I also have another linear function that's just a straight horizontal line. So because we know how to deal with area between curves, we can take the area here, represented as an integral, and then we can subtract off the area here, also represented by an integral. And when we do this subtraction, we end up with a formula. Let's go ahead and break down this formula very carefully here. So I'm going to write this out. In the red, we're going to mark this trapezoidal area here. I'm going to mark this in the red as the integral from Q equals 0 to Q naught. So my bounds are 0 to Q naught. And the function that I'm finding the area underneath is right here. That's this line, which we know to be the demand curve. Go ahead and mark that. So this is D as a function of Q. It's demand, D. And so this red integral here is D as a function of Q with respect to Q. Q is my independent variable. It's like my X, it's my X axis. So we're gonna use Q instead. And that's about as specific as we can get. That integral, this area enclosed by the red here, is all just the integral of dq from 0 to Q naught. And then likewise, with a different color here, let's go ahead and go in purple, we can integrate, or we can write an integral to represent that purple area right in there. And so that purple area, again, we'd be going from 0 to Q naught. Let's write that a little bit better. Q naught to 0 to Q naught. And the function that we're integrating, this right here is a straight line straight across. This looks to me like y equals p naught. It's just a constant. It's just y equals a number. And that number is p naught. It's a line with slope of 0. A lot of ways to talk about it. But in this sense, we just say, hey, it's just p naught dq. Remember, q is our independent variable. We can see that right there. And so we've got this difference between the red and the purple. And if we subtract these integrals from each other, we end up with just this highlighted red, this region right in here. That's what that would be if we do red minus purple. And you'll notice we can use our integral properties. We recognize that the limits of integration are the same on these integrals. And so we are allowed to subtract them and basically combine them. And this is our formula we get for consumer surplus. And just as a reminder, just so we don't get lost in the calculus of this, the math of this, the consumer surplus has to be this region up here, because consumer surplus talks about the difference between the price that you as an individual are willing to pay and the price that the company sets for those pair of shoes that we're talking about. And so there is a difference right there with the indicated by those arrows. There's a difference in price points that you're willing to pay and what the company is actually setting the price at. And that's the definition of consumer surplus. So this area, adding up all of these price points, you may go back and think of Riemann sums. If you were to add up all of these differences of price points that certain people are willing to pay versus what the actual price is, that gives you this entire area. And adding all those individual consumer surplus ups, that gives you all that area there, which gives you the total plural consumers surplus. So there we go. We've got a definition for consumer surplus. When we move on now to producer surplus, it's going to be basically the same thing. We're just going to kind of look at it from a slightly different perspective. Rather than looking at this from the perspective of the person who buys the pair of shoes, we're going to look at it from the perspective of the person who sells the pair of shoes. So let's say, again, informal definition, I know there's a lot on this slide, but just look right up here at the top. Let's say that you plan to sell a pair of shoes for $60, but when you go to sell them, the customer just hands you a $100 bill and says, oh, well, I was willing to pay $100 and you're only selling them for 60. Well, you're probably going to just try and be sneaky and you're going to say, oh, well, yeah, they cost $100. That's exactly what the price point was. Yeah, pay me $100, because you recognize that they're willing to pay $100. Well, you're obviously, as the seller, you're benefiting from this. If they're willing to pay 100 and you're actually only selling them from 60, if you can get them to pay 100, you're making $40 extra than you thought you would have. And that's what individual producer surplus is. Obviously, in a real world scenario, you probably wouldn't be able to know that someone is willing to spend 100 and edit your price tag. But maybe afterwards, maybe after the transaction goes on, you ask them, hey, what would you have paid for this? And they say, oh, I would have paid 100. Then you change your price to 100 because you know that they're willing to pay that. And that extra money, that $40 extra that you could raise your price, that's individual producer surplus. Yet again, as we've seen, this individual producer surplus will be different for everybody because different people are willing to sell the item for different prices, and the customer is willing to pay, each individual customer is willing to pay different amounts of prices. So everyone's individual producer surplus will be different. But if I add them all up, just like we did before with consumer surplus, that gives me the total producer surplus. So we're going to go back to the same idea. We're going to look at a graph here. We're going to say, hey, let's start with price quantity. We've got our axes. Let's go ahead and look at a supply curve. So as we could surmise, from a supply standpoint, from the seller's standpoint, from the producer's standpoint, you might say, if my price, let's do this. If my quantity is higher that I am producing, my costs are larger. So I need to sell for higher. I need to put the price point higher if my quantity is large. Because if my quantity is large, it's going to cost me a lot to make them. So I need to set my price really high. But if I only make a couple of them, well, my price point can be pretty low because it doesn't cost me that much to make just a handful of shoes per se. So we got our positively sloping supply curve. Again, we're going to have an equilibrium point. No need to go into that any further. We'll have an equilibrium point, P naught and Q naught right there. And then yet again, what we'll notice is here's our supply curve. And here is the price that we are willing to sell at. But as we've said, or excuse me, this is the price that we are going to sell at. But as we've seen, there are some customers who are willing to pay more. And so we're looking at this difference right here. We're looking at the difference between what the customer is willing to pay and what you're selling the price for. And so this region right in here is gonna command that idea of producers surplus, and we've got that right here. So just like we had that with consumers surplus, very similar idea with producers surplus. So we've got this region here. Yet again, we can write an integral for this. And we're gonna have to go with our area of subtraction. So let's go ahead and look at this. Let's go with a color here of purple. And if we integrate that, if we want to represent that purple encompassed area with a formula, we're going to have to say that it is the integral from 0 again to Q naught of P naught dq. And notice P naught is my function, that linear function with a slope of 0. That's what I'm integrating under. I'm integrating right under that. And I'm going all the way down to the x-axis. So this P naught dq right there gives me that sense of area for the purple. Likewise, we would also have in the orange here, again, the way I've drawn this, slightly trapezoidal, that orange area is going to be the integral from 0 again to Q naught. Those are limits for the x. And we're just going to try and find this area right in here. So if we want to find that area, we have to deal with this function right there. Well, that function is the supply curve. So I'm going to label it S. And that supply is a function of quantity. It's general, obviously. We don't know exactly what it is in this generic problem, but we know that it's supply, so we'll label it S. Well, if I take a difference of the purple, all of that right in there, and I subtract off just the orange, I'm just left with this red highlighted area right there. And that's producer surplus. So I'm going to take P naught, I'm going to subtract off S, and I'm going to integrate. And we've got our formula for producer's surplus. And so right there, we've got formulas for consumers and producers surplus. Let's go ahead and actually work out an example here. So we're gonna move on. We're gonna say, let's assume that the demand for oatmeal is 344 minus 3e to the q divided by 2. And actually, I'm going to write that a little bit different. I'm going to write 1.5 q just to make that clear. And then S, this supply, is equal to e to the 1.5 q minus 1. And we want to find the consumers and the producer surplus. So what you'll notice here is that while we had a lot of graphs and we had a lot of reasoning of how to actually come up with a formula for consumers and producer surplus, at this point, it's pretty much just plugging into a formula. So what we've got here is we've got our formulas, and let's go ahead and write those out. So we've got consumers. I'll go ahead and label this CS, consumer surplus. That's the integral from 0 to Q naught of d of q minus p naught dq. And then we've got producer's surplus, which is equal to 0 to Q naught of P naught minus S of Q. What I notice in these formulas right off the bat is that I have to know what Q naught and P naught are in order to even do these problems. If I don't know P naught and Q naught, there's just nothing I can do. So in order to find Q naught and P naught, remember, those are equilibrium points. So we have to set the demand and the supply equal to each other. Let's go ahead and do that. Let's set D of Q equal to S of Q. So we have 344 minus 3e to the 1/2 Q equals e to the 1/2 Q minus 1. Let's move that over right there, line that up. There we go. So we've got that right there. So we'll continue on. I'm going to add 1 to both sides, so I have 345. I'm going to add 3e to the 1/2 Q to both sides, so I have 4e to the 1/2 Q. Let's do 345 divided by 4 equals e to the 1/2 Q. Let's move this up. We'll probably need a little bit more space here. Kind of squeezing that in. All right, so then we have an exponential, so we need to take a natural log. So natural log of 345 over 4 equals 1/2 Q. So Q is equal to 2, multiplying both by 2 ln of 345 over 4. And this, in fact, is our Q naught right there. So we've got our Q naught. That's good. We have 2 ln of 345 over 4. Kind of complicated, but it's a number. That's okay. So now to find, well, actually at this point, we've got our Q naught and we've got our Q naught for our limits of integration, but we still need to find P naught. As you can see right in here, we still have to have P naught. So to find P naught, we take this Q naught, we plug it back into either the demand or the supply equation. And when I look at this, the supply equation looks a little bit more simple. So I'm just going to go ahead and plug it into there. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to take S of Q naught. I'll go ahead and make a note here that this is equal to P naught. So S of Q naught is E to the 1/2 times, now I'm plugging in Q naught right there. You'll notice there'll be a lot of simplification here. The 1/2 and the 2 in that exponent multiply and they cancel. Now I have e to the ln of 345 over 4 minus 1. The e and the ln cancel. I get 345 minus, or divided by 4 minus 1. And then just some fraction right there. Fraction math. Got 341 over 4. So we've got some nice Q naught and P naught here. Maybe they're not so nice, but we've got numbers for Q naught and P naught. So now it's just a matter of just plugging into these formulas. So let's go ahead and go on a new slide. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go ahead and copy this Q naught and P naught over to our new slide. Nope. There we go. So we've got that right there. Let's move that right there. Let's recolor this. There we go. So now we're just plugging in. It's just a plug and chug at this point. So we've got, this is equal to the integral from 0 to, well, Q naught, we had that in the orange, 2 ln of 345 over 4. And then D of Q, well, D of Q, we had that written right back here, right there. So we can just copy that, plug that in. So 344 minus 3e to the 1/2 Q minus P naught. Don't forget that. And remember, P naught was down here in the red, 341 over 4. dq. There we go. Producer surplus, we're going to have 0 to 2 ln of 345 over 4. P naught, as we've written already, is that 341 divided by 4, minus S of Q is written right here. So we'll go ahead and copy that. Now be careful, it is minus S of Q. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually make sure that I distribute that minus sign. So notice I write a +1 right there instead of a -1. You could alternatively put parentheses around here and put a minus instead of a plus. That would be fine. But here I'm just going to do that all in one fell swoop and just distribute that negative sign right there. At this point here, I'm not going to bother going through and actually working all of this out. These integrals, while they look kind of ugly, they're fairly simple. We've got some like terms right here that we could add together. Also right here, we could add those like terms together. An integral with an exponential should be straightforward. An integral of a constant should be straightforward. And then obviously these look annoying, they look complicated, but it's just plugging in. So we should be able to do this fairly easily. Really the setup is more what I want to focus on here. So we've got this setup for consumer and producer surplus. We've set up our integrals. At this point, we're good. Evaluating these integrals shouldn't be too tough. That right there is consumer and producer surplus. We'll go ahead and just leave it at that, and that'll be the entire lecture.